Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to create a HTTP API using AWS API Gateway service and then secure that service using Auth0. Auth0 is a very popular identity product in the industry and it is widely used by many customers. So if you don't already have a developer account with Auth0, you can go to this website auth0.com/developers and then sign up for a developer account using your Gmail ID. So I already have an account. I'm just signing into that Auth0 tenant and I'm going to use Postman for testing the API integration with Auth0. This end-to-end integration involves multiple steps like configuring the API in AWS API Gateway and then creating the configurations in Auth0 and then testing this API using Postman. So you can follow this video and if you have any questions, you can post the questions in the comments and I will be happy to answer. So let's start with the very first step of creating the HTTP API. So if you go to the API Gateway service and then select the API option, you will see this option to create a HTTP API. Let's create a new API. Name it as let's name it as Auth0 test API. Let's just review and create it for now. So as of now, this API got created, but there is nothing configured here. It's just the URL is here, but there are no routes that are configured in this API. So let's proceed with the next step of creating a couple of routes to this API. So for that, I'm going to use the AWS Pet Store API, which is available like in the public domain. So you can just search for AWS Pet Store API, you will get this page and you can then access this API. So if I access this API, it will return a JSON response with 3 records and you can even pass the ID number and then it will return only that particular ID. So let's actually go ahead and configure a route for these pet store APIs. So I will use this same values. I will name it as get pet store / pets. And I will create one more API for the other one, which is basically like pet store / pets / a parameterized value. So now I have a couple of API routes configured, but I need to proxy this routes to the actual pet store demo endpoints. So let's go to these integrations and select this one, create and attach an integration and select HTTP URI. And for the first API route, we can map it to this one. So I will select get. And for the second API, we will map it to get of /pet / a parameterized value. So now we created a couple of routes and then both these routes are actually serve as a proxy to this pet store demo endpoint. Now we need to deploy this API for us to test it. So let's actually go to the deploy and then create a stage. Let's name the stage as test and then create it. So the stage got created. Now let's go ahead and deploy this. So if you go back to the routes and select deploy, you can select that stage now and click deploy. So the API got deployed successfully. If you again go back to the stages and select test, you will find this URL. So let's copy this URL, go to Postman, paste it here, and append pet store / pets. If you remember, this is the route that we created here. So if you go back to these routes, we have /pet store / pets and another one with /pet ID. So if I access this now, I get that same response which we saw with the demo endpoint. So you can see the JSON response. Now if I pass a parameter, I get that specific record out of those 3 records. So the API setup is done. We still need to add the authorization layer to secure this API, but in order to do that, we need to first configure Auth0. So let's go to the Auth0 developer screen, and then you will see all these options in the management console. So we need to do a couple of configurations. So I will go through one by one step. The first thing that we need to do is create an API application for that AWS API Gateway endpoint. So let's create a new API application and name it as pet-store API. And for the identifier, let's just use this test URL. It's not mandatory, like you can actually add any value here. Like I can even add like test, but just for like a coding standard that I follow, like I just make sure I use the same API URL as the identifier so that it is easy to map between AWS and Auth0. So I will add that identifier and then click create. So the API is created. Let's add a couple of permissions, which is basically scopes. So the first scope that we add is read : pets, which will basically read all pets. And then we will add one more scope called read : pet, which will basically read a specific pet, which is that parameterized route. So I created a couple of scopes and the API. Now we need to create a M2M application. So let's go ahead and create the M2M application. Let's do Auth0 app and select this machine to machine option and click create. Here you can select that pet store API. So I selected it, and for now let's select both these options and click authorize. So the API got created, the application also now got created, and this pet store Auth0 application can access the pet store API which we created in the previous step, and it is authorized to use both the APIs, basically the pets API which will return all the pets, and then the pets / the pet ID API which will return a specific pet. So now that Auth0 configuration is done, we need to add the security layer on top of this HTTP API. In order to do that, go to this authorization option, manage authorizers, and create a JWT authorizer, and let's name it as Auth0 pet authorizer, and it asks for the issuer URL. So I will let you know how to get it. If you go back to the Auth0 screen and then go to the settings, so you should find somewhere here in the domains. Yeah, so this is the issuer. So this is one way to get it. The other easiest way to get it is go to the applications, select that pet store Auth0 app, and go to the bottom of the screen, select advanced settings, endpoints, and copy this OpenID configuration URL and then open it in a new tab. So this will return all the endpoints for this OpenID configuration. So copy this issuer URL and add it here. And it asks for audience. So the audience in the case of this particular API will be the API identifier that we used here when we created this API. So copy that audience and put it here, and then create. So the authorizer got created. Now we need to attach this authorizer to those couple of URLs, which is basically the routes. So I will do one thing. I will first attach this authorizer to the /pets. So now I attach the authorizer here. And if you go to this one, there is no authorizer, so it's pretty open, like anyone can access this API. If I go to this route, actually it didn't get attached, so I attached it now. So the authorizer got attached. We need to deploy it again, so let me deploy it. Now let's try accessing the first API, which is /pets. It should actually throw an error. Yes, so we got the error unauthorized. The reason is now this particular API endpoint expects an access token, a JWT access token with specific values like that audience, all those things. Then only the client can access this API. But for the next API, I didn't add any authorizer, so ideally it should work. Yes, it works as expected. So the first API is now secured, the second API is not secured. Let me add the authorizer to the second API as well. Please note that whenever you make any configuration changes, you need to deploy. In my case, I have selected manual deployment, so I need to deploy manually. There is an option for automatic deployment as well, wherein you just make the config change and it will get deployed. But for the demo purpose, I thought it's better to show each and every step. That's why I selected the manual option. So now if I try to access this API, it should give me unauthorized error. Yes, so now both the APIs are secured, which basically means it expects some kind of an access token which matches with this Auth0 pet authorizer configuration that we did here with this particular issuer URL and this audience URL. So now let's get an access token from Auth0. In order to do that, go back to the Auth0 management console, select APIs, select the pet store API, and go to this test option and select that pet store Auth0 app. Please note that here you will see multiple apps. In case you have configured multiple applications, you need to select the right application for this integration to work. So if you remember, I created this app called pet store Auth0 app. This one which is currently selected is the old one, so you can ignore that. So I selected this app, and Auth0 shows the curl command which gets executed to get the token, and it also gives the access token. If you want to see what is in this curl command, you can copy it. Again, go back to Chrome and then import raw text, paste that curl command and click continue and import. So this is the curl command which gets executed. So if you see the curl command, so this is what gets passed in the post request to the Auth0 token endpoint, and then I don't know whether it will work from here. If it works, it's fine. Yeah, it works. So basically it passes all these parameters like client ID, client secret, audience, all these details, and then it generates an access token. So let's copy this access token and view the contents of this token. So if you go to this particular website called JWT.io, which is again a Auth0 maintained website, paste this JWT token, you can see the issuer value and this audience value and then the scope which was configured for that application. So these values will exactly match with what we configured here, and it should match. If it doesn't match, then you cannot access the APIs. So now let's copy this access token, go back to this API. I'm still getting unauthorized, so let me add a header, the authorization header, and try to access the API. Now I got the response. If I unselect this, again I will get unauthorized error. So because it won't get sent, now I selected it, it's sending the token, I'm getting the response, and if I use the other API, I'm still getting the response. So now the HTTP API is secured using Auth0 JWT token. Now let's make some additional enhancements to this integration. So if you look at this, in the authorization. So if you look at this authorization, there is one additional configuration called scopes. I didn't add any scope when I did the initial configuration. Now I'm going to add a scope. So if you remember, when we created this pet store API, we created a couple of permissions, which is basically scopes. A read colon pets, which is used for reading all the pets, and a read colon pet, which is used for reading a specific pet. So let's copy this and add the scope here and save it. Similarly, go to this one and copy read colon pet, add and save it, and we need to deploy it again. So it got deployed. So if you look at this JSON token, it has both the scopes. So ideally, when I try to access this, it will still work. So because both these scopes are present, I should be able to access both these APIs. But now let's make some minor changes to this configuration in Auth0. So in order to do that, go back to the applications and select this pet store Auth0 app and go to APIs. Select this pet store API. Let me remove this read colon pets scope from this application. Now if I try to get a new token, let's see the difference in this token. So I will open a new tab. So the scope is now only read colon pet, whereas in the old token the scope is read colon pets and read colon pet. So now if I use this token to access this API, let me remove the old token, add the new token, I get a forbidden error. So if you notice the difference, initially I got unauthorized error when I didn't pass any token, but now I'm passing a valid token, but the token doesn't have the right scope to access this particular API. So I'm getting a forbidden error. But if I try to access the other API, I will get a response. That's because the new token has the read colon pet scope, and that is the reason why we are getting a response for the /pet/pet ID API, but not for the /pets API. Now let's add back this scope and remove this scope and update. And let's generate a new token. And if I copy this token, let me open it in a new tab. So I have the read colon pets scope, but not the read colon pet scope. So let me update this token again, and this API should start returning forbidden error, and this API should return the response. So in this way, you can actually keep creating multiple clients here. So I can keep creating multiple clients. So you can have a customer who is trying to access your APIs. One customer might have access to all the APIs. Another customer might have access to only couple of APIs or one API. So in this way, you can create multiple applications, and each application will represent one of the customers who is accessing your API. And depending on the permissions that you want to provide to those customers, you can assign or unassign the scopes. And based on the scopes, the customer will be able to access only specific APIs because the APIs are secured using the JWT token of Auth0. So this is a very important feature in AWS API Gateway. And if someone has to write a source code to implement this type of logic, it will involve lots of changes. The good thing is API Gateway is providing this feature out of the box. But please remember one thing, that this feature is available only in the HTTP API option. If you look at the AWS API Gateway, there are actually a couple of different APIs. So if you try to create an API, you will see HTTP API, WebSocket API, REST API, all those options. This will work only with HTTP API and not with REST API. If you want to implement something similar with REST API, that will involve writing some custom Lambda authorizers, and maybe I will post a separate video for that. But as of now, if you look at this API, we created a couple of routes as a proxy to the pet demo endpoint. I just used a website for as a proxy, but if you are building a real API, actually you can, for example, you can create a, sorry, so you can actually configure a proper API backend instead of this this kind of a HTTP URI, right? So for example, like if you create a get test API and go to integration, select the test API. So you will see multiple options here. Like you can point it to your Lambda function, like multiple things, simple queue service. I just used this HTTP URI option and pointed it to a pet demo store endpoint just for the POC, just for the testing purpose. But in reality, it can be a Lambda function, it can be anything. So this is how you build a HTTP API in AWS API Gateway and then use Auth0 to secure the APIs. I understand there are multiple steps, and if you miss any one step, it might create some issues. Please feel free to add your questions or issues in the comments, and I will respond back to you. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.